Okay, everybody, I hope that we're live and broadcasting here tonight. It seems like it's getting to be a regular thing that we have all kinds of technical difficulties as we get started here today, and a brand new different one every week as well. But I think we're past all of that. Please open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 12. We've got a little bit of catching up to do from last week, not too much, and then we'll be into chapter 13. Now, warn you in advance, I was hoping to do all of chapter 13. I usually do all of chapter 13, but tonight, as always, I'm wanting to do as full a presentation as I can in this particular broadcast. And so we're going to cover, as you can see, only the first 10 verses of the 13th chapter here this evening, and we'll do the rest of it next week. So as we get underway here, the last week's class, or class before last, I guess it was, 2 weeks ago, I did some work and presented 4 charts on how many times and the places where either the word temple or tabernacle appears in our book of Revelation, and how very important it is to us that we see that thread, appreciate that thread, and of course the consequences of God's very purposeful wending of this idea, this concept, throughout the whole book. I made a mistake, though, I discovered as I was preparing for this week's class. And so you can see I've highlighted there chapter 13 and verse 6, which I left off the list last week. So make certain that you just be aware the first slide that I showed you last time with regard to the temple and tabernacle, that's one that's on the screen now, left off chapter 13 and verse 6. I've also rearranged this slide just a little bit so that I'd like to read these aloud for those of you who are not watching the video but only listening on the audio side. So you will find the word temple or tabernacle appearing in the book of Revelation in chapter 3 and verse 12, chapter 7 and verse 15, chapter 11, verses 1, 2, and 19. So 3 times in chapter 11. Chapter 13, verse 6, chapter 14, verses 15 and 17, chapter 15, verses 5, 6, and 8, chapter 16, verses 1 and 17, and then lastly in chapter 21 at verses 3 and 22. So hopefully I've got it right this time. That's all of the passages that you have there. Please note, of course, that if you got a passage like chapter 15 and I say verses 5, 6, and 8, well, then obviously I'm just picking out the verse that has the word in it. You'll want to read a little before and after and then through to connect those verses. So you'll find the word in each verse at that location. You'll find the context, of course, as always is larger. Now, a much bigger point, though, that we need to work with last week. Chapter 12 is pretty straightforward, really. Most people are in complete agreement or awfully close unanimity in understanding this passage. So as we review that chapter, we're going to add one part of it, though, that I overlooked last week. The woman, I think certainly, is faithful Israel and or those first Christians. She begins as the woman who gives birth to the Christ, and so this is a reference to the people of God, faithful throughout the centuries, fulfilling the commands of Moses and looking forward to those prophecies. And it is from these people that the Lion from the tribe of Judah will be born. A little later in the chapter, we have her and her offspring in the wilderness, as we'll discuss in some detail here in a moment. And she now represents faithful Jews again, but including now those that have come to Christ, who have accepted the male child who will rule with a rod of iron, who is clearly Jesus the Christ. So that part's really not too difficult. The dragon is identified for us in chapter 12 and verse 9, and so Satan sought to destroy the male child upon its birth. That, of course, is fulfilled in the Gospels with Herod and the slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem. So very little controversy, if any, as far as that goes. The child is Jesus, and I think we have absolute certainty on that. And then the dragon is cast down. Some question as to when that takes place, and it depends on which of the various eschatologies and interpretations or schemes of interpretation that you employ when you're looking at the Revelation. In my understanding of the book, it took place at Jesus' resurrection. It certainly took place in the first century. It took place as a direct result of Emmanuel, God with us in his physical ministry here on the earth. But I'd like now for us to pick several verses, 4 of them, a little more actually, that I'm going to present on the screen now, which build to a theme and a question that I just forgot to mention last week. Now, I'm kind of glad I did, though. After the class concluded, Donna came. She said, well, what about this phrase right here? Why didn't you do that? And I told her, I said, well, actually, honestly, it was just complete overlook. But I have always had a bit of a problem with this, and so I was grateful for the extra week to think about it. So let's start now, everybody, and I'll put all these verses on the screen. In chapter 12 with verse 9, the great dragon was thrown down. So in some manner, some way, to some extent, we've got to try to work on how. The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So Satan and his servants, Satan and his minions, who are the great instigators of all trouble on earth, are thrown down to the earth. Now, typically, usually, maybe every time this word earth is used in Revelation, it's not about the planet. It's not about the globe. It's not about the word earth as 21st century Americans use it. It would, I think, have direct reference virtually every time. I'll have to go back and confirm if it's absolute, to the land of Israel, land of Naphtali, land of Zebulun. This is the way it's used in our New Testament. So when a thing is cast down to the earth, or when we're thinking about those who dwell on the earth, these expressions in Revelation are pointing at first century Jews who refused their Messiah, murdered their Messiah, resisted the Holy Spirit after he came as a result of the redeeming power of Christ's crucifixion, the people who resisted Jesus to the end, the people of Luke chapter 19, bring them here and slay them in my presence. Those who steadfastly would have nothing to do with fulfilling the prophecies that had been given to them and their forebears so many centuries before. So in verse 9, the great dragon is thrown down, his angels, so his powerful servants, are also thrown down. And then 3 verses later, we're told in verse 12, this is the heart of our discussion right now, woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing he has a short time. Well, this was the expression, knowing he has a short time, that Donna asked me about after the class. What short time is this? Satan understands the limitation, and let's make sure we do. So notice, though, that when he's thrown down to the earth and his angels thrown down with him, the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to them with great wrath, is going to be suffering. Woe to them. And the wrath of Satan, the devil, is particularly great. It's been enhanced because he knows he has a short time. So this fury is exacerbated, and I assume it's reaching its most towering rage, precisely because he is aware that he can only wreak this particular form of havoc to this degree for a little while. So these are clues to understanding this expression. And we've got a couple more now. The very next verse, 13, says, when the dragon saw he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth. So now this persecution is falling upon the Jewish people. It's falling upon the nation that gave birth to the Messiah, to the Savior, to the Redeemer, to the Son of God, to Emmanuel. The dragon sees that something is being taken away from him, that in this reduction of power and influence, it's called being cast down to the earth, something that began with the control of demons in Jesus and the apostles' great power, wherein, I believe it's Luke 10, Jesus says he beheld Satan falling like lightning from heaven. So it's beginning during the ministry of Jesus. It's completed somehow here, I believe, at the time of the resurrection. And Satan is really angry with this woman. He failed to kill the Messiah, and his rage now has grown. Then in verse 6 and in verse 14, twice it's repeated. It is obviously very central and important, or it would be repeated. We are told, and I've smushed these two verses together, that the woman fled into the wilderness and was nourished for 1,260 days in verse 6, or for times, and half a time in verse 14, from the presence of the serpent. Well, that's extremely helpful in trying to figure out what the short time is, what the devil understands, how he's being restricted, and why his rage is so towering. But one more clue in verse 17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So this has to be Christians now, Jews who accept their Messiah, embrace him joyfully as king, are willing to pay the highest price to be servants of his because they know that eternity awaits. It's worth the price. They've counted the cost. So the great dragon is thrown down to the earth. He's especially angry because he knows he only has a short time. When he sees he's thrown down, he persecutes the woman that gave birth to Jesus. She eventually now, in this unfolding vision, flees into the wilderness, is nourished for 1,260 days, times, and half time, which is coincidentally and very purposely in God's mind, the exact same period of time as 42 months, each of those in the real world, which is the time frame God uses. He's communicating with us. He wants us to understand. These expressions all refer to a year and a half, which is the exact length time that the Romans were involved in suppressing the revolt of the Jews and ultimately destroying them altogether so that they had neither root nor branch, fulfilling Malachi. So the dragon is enraged and he goes off to make war with Christians. Now here's what I'm getting out of this. I'm thinking that Satan is enraged for a number of reasons. He was unable to tempt Jesus to sin. He was unable, with all of his power, to prevent Jesus from so courageously fulfilling God's will and going to the cross. He's unable to prevent him from rising from the dead. And that's the final coup de grace. What power has Satan now? Jesus has the keys of death and Hades from chapter 1. And so Satan is cast down at the resurrection of Jesus. He has lost the game. He has recognized that God and Christ have succeeded in his Son in the redemption, the atoning for all sins, and those that have sought God as Gentiles under that law of the heart and conscience, as Jews under the revealed oracles of God, as Christians now who are the children of this woman, that they will escape his eternal death. He's lost. Now then, in the persecution he is wielding in chapters 12 and following, as we turn to the more earthly view, what's behind the scenes down here of what God has been instituting and instigating in the first 11 chapters. From the heavenly viewpoint, we see Satan now being used by God to fulfill his purposes, and that ultimately is to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies of the end of the Old Testament covenant and the Old Testament law. And of course, that in its temple in the fall of 70 AD prevents anyone laying claim to Jews, and there's no such thing. They can't prove they're descendants of Abraham to this day, so we have none today that could know that they are Jews. Even the very racial ties to the Bible have been exterminated. So I believe that for a short while, the power that Satan will have lies in the Roman army and his twisting it to his evil purposes, though yet he's defeated because it's all a part of the plan of God, to be bringing its physical forces. And we saw even in the pulling of the border guard from the Euphrates, as it fulfills a very specific part of a previous prophecy in Revelation, we see the full force of Rome descending upon the land of Israel, the earth of Israel, and Satan using it to good effect. In keeping with the prophecies we've seen before and we'll see again tonight shortly, Satan unleashes through the Roman army the full physical wrath of destruction and death upon these people. And that's what plays out all the way through to 70 AD until the Romans, having ultimately conquered these people, will withdraw. There's not one stone left upon another. So I'm looking at this short time here, knowing that he has a short time, as stretching from the resurrection and the building forces, the subjugation of the Jews, their resistance to the taxes, the growing problems they were having with the Romans, until the Jews forced the Romans against their will to kill Jesus on the cross, and then here come the Romans eventually to destroy them altogether. Now, 40 years may not seem like a very short time, but in the timelessness of God, of course, it is. And if you want to pick a shorter time and think that somehow it's perhaps only in the 3.5 years of the Roman invasion, well, more power to you. But it wouldn't change a lot. We're still looking at first century fulfillments of both Old and New Testament prophecies, which come to pass in the space-time continuum, proving that these are prophets because what they prophesied came to pass. We're not looking for symbols that represent symbols. We're not looking for figures of figures. We're looking for figurative speech that prophesies a physical fulfillment if we're to follow the prophets' procedures and programs, Old Testament or New. And so that's what I'm getting out of Romans chapter 12, is Satan using the Roman forces with his wrath, and then ultimately the Jews will be destroyed. Their persecuting power then is taken away. The Romans are going to withdraw and have other things to think about than Christians. There will be times when the Romans will persecute Christians. That's certainly so. But, by the time you get to Constantine in the early 300s, then, Rome is corrupting Christianity by promoting Christianity, but false versions of it. So Christianity begins to be corrupted into the modern day denominationalism, first in Catholicism and then in, Protestantism. This is the apostasy from Christ, not faithful Christians. Faithful Christians are a part of the eternal kingdom. And we've been around and will be around till the final judgment, which is spoken of briefly in Revelation in chapters to come. But Satan, he's just losing throughout the first century. While he still lives and still has a lot of influence, you don't see him using any nation like he did Rome since the first century. Not with any kind, of comparison if you know your histories. So there's Romans 12. Now, let's come on, directly you move into chapter 13 and this sea beast in these first 10 verses that we're going to consider here in a minute. Look now at verse 1. He stood on the sand of the seashore is the translation I have, the New American Standard. There are manuscript variants. So we have a problem there. It may be I stood on the sand of the seashore, depending on which manuscript that you're reading, the original Greek manuscripts that you're reading. Now, this is where I think I'd like to make a correction tonight. As you look at my syllabus on chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, the first thing that I say there is there's a textual problem, either he or I. Which is it? And up until yesterday, I had the dragon as being most likely. Now, obviously, it doesn't make a big difference. It's only a statement of who's there in the vision. So whether it's John looking at what unfolds in these verses to follow, or it's dragon standing there as a part of the vision, in either case, I can't find where it changes a single thing in our understanding of the verse. But I used to think it was the dragon for the reasons I gave. The dragon is certainly involved. He's in 13:2 and 4 and 11. John personally isn't mentioned again. Those are good arguments, and I'm all right with that. That's why some manuscripts, I suppose, have it. But now I'm changing my mind. I think it makes more sense that I, John, was on the sand of the seashore, and then I saw, is what it says in the rest of that book, or verse rather, a beast coming out of the sea. So whether it's he or I stood in the first part of that first verse, it's I saw, it follows next. And so I'm standing and I saw, seems to me, to be more likely now in the light of something that I was overlooking earlier, and that is that it says in the last verse of chapter 12 that the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. He went off to make war. Now, he still has influence everywhere on the surface of the planet, I freely grant, but in the vision, he's exiting stage left, he's gone. And so it would seem strange to me that if he goes off, the next thing we find is that he's still there. So I'm changing that. I rewrote my syllabus, and edited that part here this morning, in fact. You take it either way you like. Now let's read straight through these 10 verses. I think it is, I, John, stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who's like the beast and who's able to wage war with him? And there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, those who dwell in heaven. And it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. And if anyone is for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. So the sea beast is introduced, and the sea beast is an awesome, frightening, horrifying, extremely powerful and influential and corrupt and evil force of some kind. So in the first 10 verses of this 13th chapter, we have a sea beast, and of course in the last verses, 11 through 18, we have an earth beast, which we'll not get to this evening, but which is powerfully supporting this sea beast, the first beast. Let's note, though, that this beast doesn't go away after 10 verses. This beast is woven through the rest of the book. This beast is tremendously influential throughout everything that follows. So let's read. In chapter 14 and verse 9, this same beast appears again. Another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented
with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. So in verses 9 and 11, and the intervening verse discussing it, you have that same beast as you had in the first 10 verses of chapter 13. And again, the focus, there's an emphasis on the image of this beast, so some form or type of idol, and then people worshiping this beast, and the terrible destruction that is coming for those who do. Now, hopefully you can see on the screen there in chapter 15, the very next chapter again, verse 2, I saw as it were a sea of glass mixed with fire, those who had come off victorious from the beast and his image, and from the number of his name. Great fun for next week. Verse 18 of chapter 13. Standing on the sea of glass, holding harps of God. And you turn the page to the next chapter, 4 chapters in a row. In chapter 16 at verse 2, the first angel went and poured out his bowl into the earth, and it became a loathsome and malignant sore upon the men who had the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. And finally there, as you skip all the way down to chapter 16 and verse 13, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, which is the earth beast in the last verses, those last 9 verses of chapter, or would it be last 8 verses of chapter 13. The false prophet is the earth beast. 3 unclean spirits like frogs. They are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. So brethren, physical warfare in the form of the Roman army, which is the sea beast, and the wrath of God, the wrath of Satan behind it, because he's been cast down due to the power of the resurrection. These are the themes, not just of chapters 12 and 13, but of 14 and 15 and 16. And now watch what happens on screen here. This same beast is the beast called the Scarlet Beast that we find now in the next chapter, 17, in the book of Revelation. Let's read that. In 17:3, he carried me, that's John, away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And then when you read on, the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, but she's riding a beast. The beast and the woman are different. The woman is on the beast. The beast, we find out more about him in verse 7. And of course, that woman's going to be all important to us in a couple of chapters now. But in verse 7, we're following the thread of the sea beast, which is the scarlet beast. Now in verse 7 of chapter 17, the angel said to me, why do you wonder? See, I know this. I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was, and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast, which was and is not, is himself also an eighth, and one of the seven. And he goes to destruction. Now, I'll have much to say about this in chapter 17. There's an alternate way to translate this, and that is, he goes to destroying. So you just keep that in mind, tuck it away. We'll get to it in 4 weeks, 5 weeks maybe. But goes to destroying is a better translation, I believe. Picking up the thread in verse 12, though, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive a kingdom as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God should be fulfilled. Now, brethren, I'm hoping that right now already your head is just ringing with chimes and bells from cathedrals because of all the introductory background work we spent months preparing for this moment and those to follow. Because of Daniel, because of other prophecies. And now, putting it all together, we're seeing these heads and crowns and mountains and kings and all of this verbiage from our Old Testament. Hopefully by now it's becoming much more familiar, or at least it's ringing bells that we ought not to be any more surprised. Where's the passage right here? Bugs me in chapter 17, where 7. In chapter 17:7, the angel said, "Why do you wonder?" Well, brethren, at this point in time, if we were really successful, and I don't mean determined or accomplished. I've met a lot of very determined, very well seasoned, very intelligent, very honest, very capable, Bible students, and I don't mean to put them down at all, but I think they've missed the point. And so all I'm trying to say is that we know that it involves wisdom. We know that it's not an easy thing to understand, but at the same time, it's understandable. John's being told, you ought to know this. Why do you wonder? It is something that can be grasped and should be by the time you're getting down to the end of the book of Revelation. And so, look, I was in that basket for a long time myself. I didn't understand the book the first 3 times I taught it. I was misrepresenting it with a good heart and a good conscience. I was doing the best I can. I was a young Bible student. But as you grow and as you mature, you are supposed to get this figured out. And so I'm just doing my best, to grow myself. And I welcome the criticism, and I certainly hope that others will just simply do the same. You don't have to stick with the same interpretation that you're first handed by the most accomplished Bible student or teacher that you know. It might be that there's more than that one person you trust so much was able to gather in his lifetime. We'll let God be the judge. I'm standing on the shoulders, as we say so often, of all these other people. I couldn't be here if it wasn't for them. But, I don't think I've got it all yet either. I'm growing from week to week. I got verse 1, already. I'm corrected in chapter 12 as well. We're all of us in this together, growing. There's more to learn. But the wondering ought to come to an end somewhere along the line, at least with the stuff that is all over your Bible. And that's what we've got right here. So, that's not the end of it. I'm surprised that we get a break in chapter 18. This same beast that was in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 is also now in chapter 19 as well. Look at 19:19. I saw the beast, and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat upon the horse and against his army. And then in verse 20, the beast was seized, with him the false prophet, who performed, the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. Brother, that didn't happen in 70 AD. That hasn't happened yet to this day. That lies ahead in our future. Not all of Revelation lies in the past. The beast will be gone, though, when future events are unfolding. And so Rome isn't going to be around forever. But Rome is not the main theme of the book. Rome is the instrument of wrath in both God's, chapters 1 through 11, and Satan's, chapters 12 and following, hands. So God is in the ultimate control, but Satan's doing his evil, and Rome is a tool in both of their hands to fulfill the prophecies and bringing the old covenant to such an end that it can never be assumed again. It can never rise from the ashes of its destruction. The Jews have neither root nor branch. Now, in chapter 20 and verse 4, I saw thrones, and they sat upon them. Judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image. This is how I know the scarlet beast is the same beast in chapter 13. And had not received the mark upon their forehead, chapter 13, or upon their hand, chapter 13. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. When did they come to life? How long, of physical time is this 1,000 years? Is it literal 1,000? All good questions. We'll get to their answers. But don't you see now, as you go to the screen over my shoulder, the sea beast in 13, 14, 15, 16 is the scarlet beast of 17, 19, and 20. So there's some kind of a thread that's working through all of this. We still know, ultimately, God is telling us these things because the woman in 17 who's riding this beast is going to be eaten by it and burned by it. The woman will be destroyed by the beast. So who's the woman that gets destroyed by the beast? I am no longer thinking that this is a suicide. I am no longer thinking that it's Rome destroying Rome, or that we have forgotten the prophets and Revelation, not to mention everything we studied in the Gospels, where Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, the virgin daughter of Israel, who had become something else, not so virgin. So now let's go back to chapter 13 itself. What these beasts have in common, this is a very important chart that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. They both in 13:1 and 17:7 have 7 heads. They both in 13:1 and 17:7 have 10 horns. They both in 13:1 and 17:3 are wearing blasphemous names. They both in 13:15 and 19:20 have an image of themselves that's being worshipped by those who dwell on the earth and are not in the Lamb's Book of Life. They have a war made against the saints and Jesus in 13:7 and 19:19 that this beast is going to lose. He can make war with them if he wants, but he's going to win on one hand and lose on the other, which we'll be discussing, and he'll only be working and as a tool in God's hands and Satan's as we go along. And lastly, that earth beast in 13:11 through 17, that we have not time for this evening, is identified as the false prophet in chapter 19 and verse 20. So those last verses, 11 through 17, what is that? 7 verses. I added incorrectly earlier. But that is, the earth beast is the false prophet. They are one and the same. So absolutely, they're the same beast. It's just that we're not told it's scarlet in chapter 13. We find out that, in chapter 17, but it's the same beast eating that same whore. So now, we're going to go back to Daniel chapter 7 and wrap up our class pretty well tonight in it. Now, I'm determined we'll look again in the next 10 verses, of 13. But, brethren, it's all out of Daniel 7. So let's go back now to Daniel 7 and read all of it. I know it's been a long time since we did Daniel, and many of you will not have taken the time to go back first to find those classes on the Coburg, C-O-B-U-R-G, Road Church of Christ's website in Eugene. My apologies again. I thought my website would be up and running. I'd have all this collected for you clear back in January. Now I'm looking at a couple more months. Yeah, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, my web designer is a magnificent guy. Can't tell you how much I love and respect him, but he was up against just more than he realized. I have an enormous amount of data, and so the technical challenges are extreme, and it's just going to take longer. Eventually, I'll have all that for you, but if you go to the Coburg Road Church of Christ, and just search for that term, Coburg Road, C-O-B-U-R-G, Church of Christ, it'll pop right up, and you'd have to work your way down. I think it's, I forgot now. Is it 2017? I forgot. I think it is. But at any rate, many people haven't done it. So we're going to go back to Daniel right now, chapter 7, and read these first 7 verses. In the first year of Belshazzar, that's king of Babylon, in 553 BC, I think this is. Homer Haley says 549. He's a better scholar than I am in these regards. So 549 or 543, but 549 or 553, I'm sorry, is the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Bell rings. 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea. Another bell rings from the 10 verses we read earlier. Different from one another. First was like a lion, bing, wings of an eagle, bong. Kept looking until his wings were plucked. It was lifted up from the ground, made to stand on 2 feet like a man. Human mind was given to it. Behold, another beast, the second one resembling a bear. Hear the gong, in some church steeple somewhere. And I lost my place. It was raised up on one side, 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Thus they said to it, Rise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking. Behold, another one like a leopard. Had on its back 4 wings of a bird. Beast also had 4 heads. Dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions. Behold, a 4th beast. Dreadful, terrifying, extremely strong. Large iron teeth. Devoured and crushed. Trampled down the remainder with its feet. Different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. Bong! Well, he's contemplating the horns. Another one comes up. I think I'll skip over that. Let's go to verse 11. I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which that horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, body was destroyed, given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. He came up to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. We studied this in my Daniel class. We studied this in several Daniel classes in the introductory presentations of this Revelation series. And now as we read it again, you know who this is. It was Jesus that was presented before God. It's Jesus that received that dominion. And we've seen reference to that dominion here in the book of Revelation in the last couple of chapters. Clearly, Daniel is talking about the identical historical events that Revelation is referencing. And those events are about the conquest of death and Hades, and therefore Satan, by our Lord Jesus at the crucifixion, most especially at the resurrection. And all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. Now we skip ahead to verses 16 through 18. I approached one of those who were standing by, Daniel speaking again, began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So now it's not a figure anymore. Now we're going to know what it represents. And if the same figure is used in Revelation, then this interpretation tells me what it's talking about. Verse 17. These great beasts which are four kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. We only have ages to come while the earth is turning. We have eternity in heaven. We have ages on the earth. Then 19. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, teeth of iron, claws of bronze, devoured, crushed, trampled, 42 months, the remainder with his feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns on its head, the other horn that came up, before which 3 fell, that horn which had eyes and mouth uttering great boasts, larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking. The horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. Until the Ancient of Days came, judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Not heaven. They took possession of the kingdom. The saints don't own heaven. They take possession of the kingdom on the earth. And I know they don't really own it, but we are the people that live in it. We are the people that are spreading the gospel of that kingdom. We are that kingdom down here on the earth. You take possession of that. In verse 23, he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. He'll be different from the previous ones, will subdue 3 kings, and he'll speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he'll intend to make alterations in times and law. They'll be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Revelation 12:14 uses that same expression. Daniel uses it in chapter 12, verses 5 through 9. It's found in chapter 13, verses 5 through 8 of Revelation also. In Revelation 11, 1 through 3. It's found in all those places. It's the same period of time, and it's 3.5 years. Time times in half a time is 1,260 days, and it's 42 months in the real world as human beings whom God is passing this information to count time. But in 26, the court will sit for judgment. His dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. And then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one, subsets of a subset. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. Well, it was a revelation back there too, wasn't it? It had an interpretation back there, didn't it? And the fourth beast is Rome, isn't it? You know that. It is incontrovertible. It may be deniable, but you'll lose that argument when you deny this, because that's what it is. How I wish I could spend 3 more classes on Daniel like I did months ago when I taught the introductory lessons here. But at this point, I want to harken back to my notes here that I believe, can sum it up as best as I may, because I'm running out of time quickly here. Pardon me. But see something that I've got in the syllabus in the third line now of that first section, where it says, same heads, horns, and crowns that are on the dragon, which is Satan, in Revelation 12:3. Satan is behind Rome. Satan is pushing Rome. Satan is using Rome. Satan is guiding Rome. Satan is forcing Rome to do his bidding. Rome doesn't need a whole lot of pushing, though. It's as corrupt can be. It's willingly serving Satan, and unwittingly, as was Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and Assyria before him, and the Medes and Persians after, as an instrument in God's hands. So the curtain's being pulled back to see what's going on behind the scenes in the same destruction of Jerusalem we find throughout the first 11 chapters. We view now Satan's part in it and Rome's part in it to understand how vicious and horrifying it is, and how ugly and blasphemous it is that Rome comes to destroy this harlot. Now, the next thing I wrote in the syllabus is much the same vision as Daniel 7, and we just read all those verses that I said see especially, but it's the next line I want you to get. In Daniel 7:17, we just read it, and in verse 23, when you put those two together, we are told that beasts equal kings in prophetic terminology, and that they also represent kingdoms. Now get that. That is so important. Go back and study it in Daniel, at your leisure. Beasts equal kings equal kingdoms. We are told this in the interpretation. Then see in the next part of that same line, and in Daniel 7:24, with what I didn't read, you'll have to do it yourself tonight, chapter 8, verses 20 through 22, you there find out that horns also equal kings, and kings equal kingdoms. These terms can be used interchangeably. A king can represent a kingdom, so a whole dynasty, a whole set of kings can be referred to as the king, because now that king has some sort of prominence and is representing the rest of those kings in that kingdom. Now, brethren, these are inspired interpretations. They're keys to understanding the terminology we've already had interpreted for us in the Old Testament that now is presented by God through John, because it's talking about the same thing in both places. It was prophesied by Daniel, and now it's being prophesied by John. But when it was prophesied by Daniel, it was far off. John tells us now its fulfillment is near. So these help us to understand what's going on. So now let's come back to refresh ourselves in the 10 verses of Revelation before chapter 13, before we go to my verse 3 in the syllabus. So now as we're totaling up this information, hopefully by putting it all on the table before you now, today, that we can kind of open the box now and show what it's all about. I stood on the sand of the seashore and saw a beast in 13:1 coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns, 7 heads, on his horns 10 diadems, on his heads blasphemous names. The beast I saw is like a leopard. We saw that as one of the kingdoms in Daniel 7. Feet were like those of a bear. We had the bear in Daniel 7. Mouth like the mouth of a lion. We had the lion in Daniel 7. The kingdoms following Babylon. And the dragon gave him its power, throne, great authority. I saw one of his heads. So this now composite beast, dominion was passed on, though the first 3 beasts had been done away. That dominion is still held by Rome, the 4th beast, and it's wielding that sort of carnal power. And so now this composite beast is Rome, which has inherited the preceding kingdoms. Now the worst of these This beast is described as having one of its heads as having been slain, but the fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth is amazed and followed after this one beast that had a head that got killed and yet lives. And they worship, in verse 4, the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worship the beast, saying, who's like the beast and able to wage war with him? Now, before we get to the most important part of the interpretation, let me just say, I believe that proskuneo is the word for worship has been misunderstood. Now, it's properly translated worship. Worship it means, worship it is, worship is what it's talking about. But I still say we may have missed the point a little bit, thinking too religiously. Worship in our minds is about bending the knee before God to pray, to sing, to show our obeisance in a form that we define very confined, I think, as worship in a very religious setting, an assembly kind of a setting. The word more generally means to bow the knee or to do obeisance or to show respect. And so what I'm thinking is involved here is not necessarily people worshiping as if Rome were a god, though they did. But I think we should recognize that even the Jews can be described by this term proskuneo as bending the knee to Rome, even if they, those unfaithful Jews who were not in the Lamb's Book of Life and were the people who dwell on the earth, even if they're not worshiping religiously an idol or some form of Rome as a god, they can still be described as proskuneoing, to put the two languages together, the beast, which is Rome. They can still be described that way. So let's be careful we not kind of take the word too far or in too limited a sense here. Now, to my notes in 13:3. Revelation 17:9 shows us that heads equals mountains equals kings. At Julius Caesar's death, it seemed that the empire was mortally wounded because Caesar had come out of the triumvirate, ruling over not as kings, not as Caesars, not as emperors, but as a triumvirate in a republic. He had risen out of this to seize sole control. He was even offered by some the title of emperor and the official power of an emperor, though he was wielding it. He had crossed the river Rubicon. There was no turning back. And so he had seized sole power. There was no longer a triumvirate, and there was no longer a republic. And his very name, Caesar, reigning from 48 to 44 BC, if my recollection is correct, it was correct, he as emperor is then stabbed to death. They say 23 wounds. And the empire, sole rule, a Caesar over Rome, came to an end for 13 or 14 years until the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Augustus, became the longest reigning Caesar of them all. The fatal wound in the killing of Julius Caesar, of an empire ruled by a single king, an emperor, a Caesar. We get the name from Julius Caesar to mean sole king like that over Rome, is resurrected. The fatal wound is healed. The empire is back. The triumvirate and the republic is gone now forever. And we have family dynasties, as long as they can last, from that point on. Brethren, why do you wonder? If we understood Daniel 2, 7, 8, and all the way through 10 and 11 and 12, then it's ought to not be such a hard thing to understand. We're living on the other side after it's all been fulfilled. It's Rome. It's the history of Rome. It's the four beasts that Daniel saw in a composite now, and with Julius' death as the first Caesar, which surely he actually was indeed and fact, whether modern people count it that way or not, the Bible does, and the first century people did. He is the one who died. That's the fatal wound. And yet in Augustus, the empire is back. And everybody's amazed, and they worship the dragon, because if you succumb to Rome's power, which, by the way, for a long time had been represented and believed to be a deity, and Rome had for a long time now, prior to the writing of the book of Revelation, been putting its heads, busts of statues of Caesars as gods in temples throughout all the countries that they'd conquered, in those countries' temples. The one exception is Jerusalem. The Jews wouldn't do it. They would not have it. And it caused Rome no end of embarrassment, anger, and eventual outright wrath. But the Romans could never get the Jews to put one of those gods in their temple where everybody else was succumbing. That's what this beast is about. Succumbing to the power of Rome because you will not accept Jesus as your Messiah, Jew or Gentile, as now 35 years from the resurrection to the writing of the book of Revelation has gone by. Paul's work is all, accomplished. He's soon to lose his head, apparently, and become one of these martyrs under the altar. This man, Paul, was successful in his mission to the Gentiles. So they worship the dragon in verse 4 in that manner, in that way. They won't, offer their commitment to Christ. So they're ruled by Satan and Rome. They're bending the knee. Who is like the beast? Who's able to wage war? Well, nobody could conquer Rome in those days. There was given to him in verse 5 a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. Authority to act for 42 months was given to him. 42 months is the length of time that the Romans were in Israel. 42 months is the length of time stipulated in chapter 11. There was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship it, and leave out the court outside the temple. Don't measure it. It's been given to the nations, and they, Rome, will tread underfoot the holy city. That's Jerusalem. For 42 months. And they'll grant authority to my two witnesses, the law and the prophets. They'll prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth, in the sense that the law and the prophets that so long prophesied this invasion. I reference Malachi the most, but it's in Isaiah, it's everywhere. And so you have its fulfillment. And these prophets that are raised from the dead, as we studied a couple of weeks ago, because their prophecies are fulfilled, the law and the prophets are fulfilled. So to wrap up our class today, in verse 6, he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, which is those who dwell in heaven. Please write down in your syllabus at verse 6, because I didn't put it there, but I've now added it in my newly edited syllabus that nobody's seen yet, where it says, those who dwell in heaven are the saints, whether Jews before Christ or Christians later. Right, the confirmation for that is Philippians 3:20 and Ephesians 2, verses 5 and 6. Philippians 3:20, Ephesians 2, verses 5 and 6. It makes sure that there in that same line, somehow you add Revelation 11, verse 2, where you find the 42 months, the length of Rome's war with the Jews as times of the Gentiles of Luke 21:24, in the line immediately above the one that's marked as 13:6. So get those two notes there. These must be the same thing. I revere the men that have gone before and missed this. I wouldn't know this if I hadn't studied their material. I think if they were still living, and some of them who still are may yet get here. But I'm that certain that this is what we're talking about in these passages. It was given, verse 7, just like chapter 7 of Daniel said, to him, to Rome, to make war with the saints and overcome them. The saints in this case are the Jews who are destroyed. The kingdom of Christ can never be overcome.
But the Jews were, they were the Old Testament set apart, not because they were faithful, but because they were born of Abraham, and they are overcome. This is specifically prophesied by Daniel. We've studied it at length. In authority, every over tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to the beast, which is Rome. Certainly the case. All who dwell on the earth worship him. Bend the knee, surrender, put their pinch of salt on that altar to Deo Roma. Verse 8, all who dwell on the earth will worship him whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. We are told that this is not all that easy to understand, but you're supposed to understand it, and if you'll get through the effort of it, you will. 10. If anyone is for captivity, there in that first century, as these prophecies are fulfilled, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword, in these things that are near and shortly to come to pass, with the sword he must be killed. Here's the perseverance of the faith of the saints. They will flee the city. In Matthew 24:15 through 18, they will obey Jesus' command. They'll lose everything. It'll be awful. They'll be hunkered down out there in the wilderness with next to nothing because of the haste of their flight. It'll be far worse than what they experienced in the Exodus. Those people got a bunch of money, could hardly carry it, and were ready and prepared to go. But these people had to jump and run. And so, brethren, they'll have to persevere. But if they're out there in that wilderness, they'll be that woman. 1,260 days, 42 months, times and half a time, 3.5 years, because they saw the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15. They saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies in Luke chapter 21, starting in verse 20, and they fled. This is what the first 10 verses are talking about. Rome is a monster, ruled willingly by the devil himself, who has only a short while to use them against the old covenant people who dwell in the land and are not written in the Lamb's book of life. That beast is going to eat them, and will, by the time we get to chapter 17. Love you all so much. There's a meal for you. Have a good week.